A good Erev Shabbos. Let's be thankful for what we do have. We're able to gather now during weekdays and Shabbos for a minyan, and thank heavens and thank the minyanaires. The daily minyan is going strong, Monday through Friday. So if anyone was waiting to join, it's safe. You can come now every day at 7 a.m. Thankfully, we have Zoom, so we're able to continue our learning most every day of the week, sometimes more than once a day, which is really a great thing. We're able to keep in touch with one another by phone, by email, sometimes even with a visit. So, Baruch Hashem. And yet, what are we missing? The Kiddush table. Not to rub it in too much, but the schmaltz herring, the salmon skewers, the kugel, the cholent, the coffee, the cake, the l'chaim. What are we missing? A ready table. That's what we're missing. And that's what people enjoy sharing together, gathering around a ready table. The classic commentator Rashi makes reference to a ready table in this week's parsha, Mishpatim. Rashi comments on the first verse of our Sedra this week, chapter 21, verse 1 of Shemais, of the book of Exodus. The verse itself says, Ve'ele ha-mishpatim, and these are the laws, or judgments, or halachos, asher tasim lifneihem, that you should set before them, meaning God's telling Moshe to place these laws before the Jewish people. Rashi explains the and at the beginning, and how the Torah connects the Mishpatim, or the judicial laws, with the laws that we heard at the very end of last week's parsha. Then he remarks on the phrase, that you shall set before them, and he says, K'shulchan ha'aruch umuchan le'echol lifnei ha'adam, like a table that's set before a person and ready to eat. Now here's a little public speaking tip. If you want to get the attention of a room full of Jews who are either talking to each other, thinking about other things, or otherwise preoccupied, start talking loudly about a table set before people ready to eat. In a half a second, the room will go quiet. People will say, "What did he say? When's the food going to be ready? When can we eat?" They say that that's the most universal of all the questions asked at the Seder. When do we eat? The image of a ready banquet table certainly anticipates the great codification of Jewish law, which is titled Ready Table, Shulchan Aruch, Shulchan Aruch, first published by Rabbi Yosef Karo about 4.5 centuries after Rashi, together with its notes from Rabbi Moshe Isserles of Krakow, affectionately called the Mapa, or the tablecloth. Yet even more than that, the imagery of food is something that everyone relates to, everyone looks forward to. It gives us the sense that as much delight as we have in eating, we should also have that much delight in, and we should take sustenance from and derive our soul's nourishment from Torah. That's how we should look at all the mishpatim and all the other halachos and all the other mitzvahs, nourishment for the soul and delicious too. Since this week's parsha contains in it the famous eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth passage, ayin tachas ayin, shein tachas shein, it's a good moment to discuss how we understand the Torah that we read in shul every week, or at least 3 times per week, with our constellation of mitzvahs that illumine our lives day to day and give it meaning and holiness. The written Torah, quite literally written by a scribe on parchment and kept in the Aron Kodesh right here, the holy ark in every shul, is the text which we read publicly, we read it out loud, and when we study it, when we understand what its message for us, we understand it through the lens of Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral Torah, the Mishnah, Talmud, Midrash, commentaries like Rashi's, codes, and responsa. Taken all together, this gives us Jewish life and eternal truth. A casual reader might open this week's portion and see in the second aliyah, eye for an eye, and think, oh, retribution. Ruvain hurts Shimon. Shimon gets to hurt Ruvain right back. That's eye for an eye. No, it's not so. As all the commentaries explain at great length, this is talking about compensatory damages. How do we know this? If you read it, that doesn't seem to be what it says. Because we read this verse with Rashi and the other classical commentators, which refers us to the Mishnah, to the Gemara, chapter 8 of Baba Kama, the first tractate in the order of damages, which records the sages' discussions of how exactly damages are to be reckoned, what the process is, and under what circumstances. That's how we know what it means. And even from the Talmud, when you look in the Talmud, we still don't decide the halacha from there. We still don't derive our practical rules, our marching orders day to day. Those of us who learn Gemara in our times, and if you don't, but you'd like to, there's a wealth of resources online and in our very own shul to get you going. Those who learn Gemara today know that sometimes what the Talmud discusses sounds like it's at a pretty considerable distance from our practice that we're familiar with. 1,000 years ago, Rabbanan would have looked into the Gemara to see how the cases suggest how to render a decision. Since those times, in the intervening millennium, since the Rambam's codification and also the writings of Rabbi Yitzhak Alfasi of Fez, Rabbeinu Asher of Cologne, Germany, later moved to Toledo in Spain, along with all the other great legal minds of their era who voiced their opinions on the great legal questions of their times and earlier times, keeping the halachic discussion going and relevant and applied to modern times, whatever modern times was. All those opinions were summarized and synthesized by Rabbeinu Asher's son Yaakov, who organized the laws practicable outside Israel in times of exile, into a book called Arba Turim, the Four Towers. And that format is the basis for Rabbi Yosef Karo's Shulchan Aruch, the ready table 2 centuries later, which is the latest compilation of halacha that we have. So Shulchan Aruch's ready table code of laws for kosher slaughter, for marriage, for liabilities and damages, public and private prayer, forming and dissolving business partnerships, functioning of courts and witnesses and testimony, and every other facet of contemporary life is addressed in that book with the tshuvas, the legal opinions in the century since then, up to our present day, taking those legal principles and applying them to internet commerce and kidney transplantation, labor law, public versus private responsibilities and limitations, travel back and forth across the international date line, medically assisted reproduction, and even space travel. Work is underway to address the halachic implications of cloning and artificial intelligence and self-driving cars and all the other interesting parts of life that await us in the future. As Shlomo HaMelech, as King Solomon writes in Koheles, there's nothing new under the sun. Everything that we invent or discover or otherwise encounter in our lives is part of the human experience, and it finds a place in the worldview of halacha, of Jewish law, of Torah and mitzvahs. Everything that we'll find, everything that we'll come across has a parallel or a model somewhere in the halachic conversation. The sages of each era help us understand how to make everything in our lives holy and special and Jewish, and how to bring godliness to everything we do, everywhere we go. Now that we've touched the surface of this first verse of the week's Parsha, let's not forget the first word, actually the first letter of the Parsha. We mentioned it before, and ve'ela, and these are the judgments. Rashi tells us here that this construction of and these is deliberate and full of meaning. Wherever you see that, it connects the verse with the foregoing, whatever came just before it. He explains that just as the foregoing mitzvahs, the 10 commandments that we read last week, are from Sinai, so are these also from Sinai. 4 dozen plus mitzvahs in this week's Parsha, nearly a tenth of all the 613 mitzvahs, including the legislation of damages and torts and contracts, witnesses, civil procedure. This is also Misinai. This is also God-given, divine, holy, and from Mount Sinai. When we're following those laws, it's no less holy, no less Jewish than making Kiddush on Friday night, sitting in a sukkah, or lighting the Hanukkah menorah. All that proceeds from the revelations at Sinai, and that revelation is daily and ongoing to our present day and on into the future till the end of time. This Shabbos is also very special in that we're blessing the new month of Adar Rishon. Since we spoke at length now about the rabbinic tradition, Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral Torah, let's note that in that vein that the months in the Torah Shebechsav, the written Torah, are given only by number, not by name. We know the names of the months only thanks to the sages. So we know that the first month where the Torah, the written Torah that we read from the scroll in Shul, mentions the first month, the sages explain to us that's called Nisan. That's when Pesach happens. There's also a mitzvah to sound the shofar, according to the Torah, the written Torah, on the first day of the 7th month. That's why we hear the shofar on the first day of Tishrei, and it's called Rosh Hashanah. Furthermore, the way that we know when the new month begins is by proclamation of the Sanhedrin, the great court in Jerusalem. A few years ago, Our Tuesday morning Talmud group studied tractate Rosh Hashanah, which gave us great detail and insight into the procedure of proclaiming the new month, the requirement of the witnesses, and so many other details. Furthermore, since the Sanhedrin is not in session at the moment, just for the last 1,950 years or so, we can thank the great sage Hillel Hanasi, who was an Amora of the fifth generation, not to be confused with the Tana Hillel that you know from the Mishnah. This latter day Hillel set the Hebrew calendar on course based on astronomical calculations. Astronomical? Yes. Which still serve us very well today. We still proclaim the new month, and the Chazan does so holding a Sefer Torah, and we stand to recall how it was done in temple times. But now we don't base it on the testimony of witnesses. Rather, we have Hillel's wonderful, beautiful calendar that tells us long in advance how each year will go, and when the flexible months of Cheshvan and Kislev will have 29 days, when they'll have 30 days. Furthermore, since Pesach is supposed to be a springtime festival, the rabbis had the ability to intercalate, which means to add a month, an extra Adar in the calendar in, let's call it generously, late winter, early spring, to push Nisan forward 4 weeks further into the springtime, so that the springtime festival will truly come in spring. It's a hope in Toronto. Hopefully, happens more or less every year. Even though every day, so there are some years where we see ourselves going out of Egypt, and there's quite a bit of snow still on the ground. Anyway, when we have this leap year, it balances the lunar year, which is 354 days, 8 hours, 48 minutes, and 34 seconds long, give or take, with the solar year, which, as you know, is approximately 365 days, 5 hours, 48 minutes, and 46 seconds long. So we add that extra month of Adar on a regular basis. It comes up 7 times every 19 years. And wouldn't you know it, this year is one of those years. So this year we'll have an Adar Rishon, a first Adar, starting next week. It won't have Purim in it, as Adar should have, but it will have Purim Katan, the small Purim, meaning we'll omit Tachanun on that day, and for good measure on Shushan Purim Katan also. But we will not read the Megillah or observe those other mitzvahs of Purim until the following month, which is Adar Sheni. In any event, you should feel free to eat as many hamantashen as you like between now and then. So this Shabbat is Shabbos Mavarchim Adar Rishon. The reappearance of the moon will take place in Jerusalem, the eternal and undivided capital of Israel, Tuesday afternoon at 3:07 and 16 parts. De Moilad Vetzain, Dienstig nach Mittag, 7 Minuten nach Drei Zeger mit 16 Chalakim. Rosh Chodesh will be Tuesday and Wednesday, so it starts actually Monday night. Since it's a mitzvah to be happy in the month of Adar for the great deliverance of the Jewish people that took place in that month in the times of Queen Esther and Mordechai, there's a debate in the halachic literature, a conversation amongst the sages about whether that extends in a leap year into the first Adar as well as the second Adar when Purim is actually celebrated. So let's be stringent upon ourselves and take the view that we should be happy in both Adars, first Adar and second Adar. So 60 days of gladness and rejoicing and appreciation. In recognition of that, may God give us many more reasons to be happy and to be thankful for all the wonderful things that happen to us, even from this Shabbos already going forward. May we always be surprised by the abundance of good things happening all around us and all in good health. Shabbat Shalom.